Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
The sound of metal on metal is not something you ever forget, especially when it's the sound of your brand new car, the one you worked late nights and weekends to afford. Crumpling like a soda can under the reckless hands of someone who has never once had to earn anything in his life. I remember standing there, staring at the twisted front end, the hood bent upward like a cheap tent, headlights shattered into a mosaic on the pavement, and in the middle of it all, my brother Eric leaning against the door with a smirk plastered on his face, as if the whole thing was some kind of joke. He didn't even try to look ashamed. Instead, he looked me straight in the eye and said the line that burned into me like acid: "Mom and Dad will make you forgive me." He didn't ask for forgiveness, he didn't apologize, he simply announced it as though my parents' approval was the only currency that mattered and my feelings, my effort, my money were irrelevant. I should have shouted right then. I should have let him feel the full force of the anger boiling inside me, but something stopped me, something deeper than rage. I looked at his smug grin, his casual lean, the way his hands slid into his pockets as if he was already bored of the scene, and I realized that yelling would only feed him. He wanted me to snap, to be the overreacting sister so he could roll his eyes and let Mom and Dad step in like referees. Instead, I stood there in silence, forcing my breathing into long, controlled pulls of air while my jaw clenched so tightly I thought my teeth might crack. It didn't take long for my parents to arrive. Mom rushed out of the house first, her hand already covering her mouth in exaggerated shock, but before she even reached the car her eyes had flicked to Eric, softening, as though she needed to reassure herself he wasn't hurt. Dad followed, his face caught between concern and annoyance, as if the damage to the car was more of an inconvenience than a violation. Neither of them asked how I was feeling, whether I was okay, or whether I wanted to strangle the idiot who had just trashed the thing I was most proud of. Instead, Mom rushed to put her arms around Eric, patting his back and murmuring, "Thank God you're all right, sweetie," while Dad muttered something about, "Accidents happen, and that's why they call it insurance." I wanted to scream that it wasn't just an accident, that Eric had taken my keys without asking, that he had been drinking the night before and his license had been suspended once already for reckless driving. I wanted to tell them I had begged them for years to stop covering for him, that every time they excused him, he grew bolder, meaner, and more entitled. But I kept my mouth shut, because I knew this battle wasn't going to be won on the driveway with the headlights still warm from the crash. This was going to take more than words, and I had something none of them knew I had: proof. Eric straightened up, brushing invisible dust from his jeans, and shot me a look that was half challenge, half victory lap. "See? No big deal," he said, his voice dripping with the kind of arrogance only someone who has never been held accountable could muster. "We'll call the insurance. They'll fix it, and you'll get over it. Like always." He winked at me as though we were in on some private joke, except I wasn't laughing, and I wasn't part of his game anymore. That night, while the house was quiet and everyone assumed I was sulking, I sat at my kitchen table with the insurance report spread out in front of me, reading each line until the words blurred and sharpened again. It confirmed what I already suspected. Eric had been behind the wheel, unlicensed, reckless, and lying. The report listed prior incidents, flagged inconsistencies in his statements, and clearly stated that the policyholder, that would be me, would not be held liable for damages caused by an unauthorized driver. My hands shook as I read it, not with fear but with a rising, calculated satisfaction. For once, the weight of evidence was on my side, and no amount of parental coddling or brotherly smugness could erase what was written in black and white. Eric thought he was untouchable, that Mom's tears and Dad's lectures about family would smooth everything over like always. But as I sat there, tracing my finger over the words "unauthorized driver," I realized he had no idea that the shield he had relied on his whole life was finally gone. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, letting the silence fill the room. For years, I had been the quiet one, the accommodating one, the sister who swallowed her anger and let things slide for the sake of keeping the peace. But as I folded the report back into its envelope and slid it into the drawer, I knew something had shifted. I wasn't going to yell or throw a tantrum. I wasn't going to beg my parents to take my side. I was going to let Eric walk right into the storm he had created, blind to the fact that this time, I wasn't cleaning up after him. When I saw him the next morning, sitting at the kitchen counter with a bowl of cereal, laughing at something on his phone, I felt an eerie calm. He looked up at me with that same smirk, ready to gloat, but I smiled back, calm, collected, maybe even too calm. Because what he didn't know was that the game had already changed, and he wasn't holding the cards anymore. The insurance report sat quietly in my drawer, waiting, and with every careless laugh, every smug glance, Eric walked closer to the moment his smile would finally disappear. And when it did, I promised myself I would be there to watch it fade. My parents arranged dinner as if détente could be served on a platter alongside overcooked salmon and a bottle of grocery store Chardonnay. And while the table looked like the kind of scene you might find in a magazine that still believes families resolve things by passing the peas and speaking from the heart, the air carried the heavy sweetness of manipulation that I've learned to recognize the way a storm dog senses thunder, because before I even sat down, my mother's voice softened into that pleading tone that says she already decided who the injured party is, and it certainly isn't the woman whose name is on the registration. She touched my arm with theatrical gentleness and began a speech about unity and grace and how, in this family, we do not let one mistake define a person, and then my father chimed in with a practical sermon about premiums, deductibles, and the way life is easier when we all share the load, which sounded less like wisdom and more like a coded instruction for me to swallow the bill the way I have swallowed so many smaller indignities over the years. Eric arrived late, wearing the grin of a man who has learned that time itself bends around him, dropped his keys on the counter as if daring me to protest, and launched into a breezy anecdote about how accidents just happen and cars are replaceable and feelings are temporary. And although I wanted to ask him if a suspended license also just happens and whether unauthorized joyrides count as accidents when they begin with theft, I simply stirred my salad, counted a slow 10 in my head, and let my gaze rest on him the way you watch a fuse burn down when you already know what is wired to explode at the end. My mother, encouraged by my silence, pushed a carefully folded napkin toward me and began recounting every time in childhood that Eric had been sensitive and misunderstood, highlighting stories where I, the allegedly stronger sibling, stepped in to help. And the tale was so polished by repetition that I could feel it sliding over our present like lacquer, sealing in the gloss and sealing out the truth. When my father finally said the words I had been expecting, be the bigger person, Sarah, sign the claim, let insurance deal with it, we will all move on, I set my fork down and asked if anyone at this table had even a passing interest in the facts as they occurred in daylight rather than the bedtime version we tell to avoid nightmares. And after a silence that stretched long enough for Eric to roll his eyes and lean back in his chair with theatrical boredom, I remarked that I had already spoken with the adjuster, that the policy was unambiguous about unauthorized drivers, and that while I was terribly sorry the universe had failed to assign Eric a personal safety net made of my finances, the universe had, in a rare show of fairness, provided paperwork. My mother tried to interrupt with a plea about love and forgiveness, but I smiled pleasantly and told her forgiveness was a beautiful garden I was cultivating for worthier guests, and then, because clever revenge does not always arrive with symbols, I mentioned in the calmest tone I could muster that the wreck had been transferred that afternoon to a reputable body shop that required the responsible driver to authorize any work and place a deposit before they would even begin an estimate, which meant the invoices, the calls, and the storage fees were now directed to the cell number listed by the man who had been behind the wheel, a man currently lounging in my mother's dining room making jokes about fate. Eric sat up so fast his chair scraped the floor, declared that I had no right to drag him into this mess, and then checked his phone only to find the first of what would become many polite, insistent messages from the shop asking for a credit card to cover the daily storage and a signature acknowledging that the vehicle had been brought in after an incident involving a driver not named on the policy. And while he sputtered about harassment and misunderstandings, my father began to frown in a way I recognized from bill-paying nights when numbers refused to obey Hope, and my mother, whose default setting is protection when the baby boy looks rattled, turned the shade of a porcelain doll that has sat too long in the sun. I kept my voice even and explained that nothing unkind had happened, that the world simply had been set back into alignment so that actions might meet consequences without passing through the usual soft filter of my patience, and then, because I have learned that proof binds better than speeches, I said I would send a short email summarizing the facts for everyone's records, an email that would be polite, accurate, and, most importantly, archived. That night, after I drove home with the kind of quiet that follows a small and necessary earthquake, I composed that email with the balance of a tightrope walker who knows that one exaggerated step becomes a fall, and I wrote, with no adjectives and no blame, that my vehicle had been taken without my permission on a morning following a night in which the unlicensed driver had been drinking, that damage occurred, that I had notified my insurer within the required window, and that the vehicle was now in the care of the shop awaiting authorization and payment from the person identified in the report as the driver, and then I hit send to Eric, copied my parents, and attached the case number so that whenever the next round of selective amnesia set in, the facts would be waiting in their inboxes like a mirror none of them wished to look into. Within minutes, Eric replied with the kind of bravado that sprints ahead of fear, typing that he had not stolen anything and that I never said no. When he wanted to borrow the car, a sentence so perfectly self-incriminating that I read it twice, saved a PDF, and felt a clean satisfaction bloom in my chest, because sometimes revenge travels not on a scream, but on an admission the guilty cannot help but write with their own hands. The calls from the shop continued the next day, accompanied by a polite notice that storage fees would increase at the end of the week. And while my mother tried to broker a new deal involving a family pool of funds and a gentle rewrite of history in which no one was at fault and everyone was a little bit sorry, my father began asking Eric pointed questions about the suspension he had assured them was ancient history, and somewhere between those questions and the shop's third voicemail, the smirk I had seen on the driveway faltered, then cracked, then went looking for a place to hide. I made coffee, answered work emails, and let the silence of not rescuing him do what my speeches had never done, because the truth was walking toward him with a clipboard and an hourly rate. And it did not care that he was the baby or that my mother kept a shoebox of his childhood drawings to prove he once had a tender heart. By sunset, when the light turned the kitchen floor the color of worn copper and my phone vibrated with a new notification, I opened the mailbox and found a thick envelope from the insurer, heavy in my hand in the way a verdict has weight before you read the judgment, and as I slid my finger under the seal I thought about the 1,000 times I had been told that family means forgiveness. And I wondered whether the people who say that have ever had to forgive someone who counts on it like a get-out-of-jail card. I took the first page out, scanned the opening paragraph, and felt the ground tilt just enough to change the angle of everything. Because beneath the standard language about investigations and coverage there was a line that did not belong to any bedtime story my mother had ever told, a line that hinted at consequences no one at that table had considered. And before I read it again, I folded the letter closed, slipped it into my desk drawer beside the printed PDF of Eric's reply, and sat very still, listening to my phone ring in the next room with another call from the shop that I did not answer. Because some storms do not require you to chase them. Sometimes you just have to open the window and let the wind come in. The envelope waited on my desk through the morning and into the afternoon while I told myself to work first and feel later. But when the house settled into that weekday hush where the only sounds are the soft complaint of the refrigerator and the occasional groan of the heating ducts, I opened the letter and discovered that the insurance company, in its unemotional language that never once uses the word betrayal, had confirmed two details that were both unsurprising and devastating, namely that Eric had been recorded at the tow yard as identifying me as the driver at the scene, an error, they called it, later corrected in a supplementary statement, and that his license, rather than being fully reinstated as he had insisted over lasagna and performative contrition last month, remained under restricted status pending compliance with a court-ordered program, which, translated into the reality we all inhabit, meant that he had no business behind any wheel that day and very much knew it. I read the paragraph twice, then a third time, feeling the old reflex rise in my throat, the one that says, "Call Mom, explain gently, give them time to process." Because the habit of protecting other people from the consequences of their choices can feel like kindness when you are tired, but I set the letter down and made coffee instead, because I was done editing truth so it would go down easier. That afternoon, when Eric texted me a breezy question about whether I had taken care of the claim yet, I answered with a neutral sentence. Please refer to the policy and the shop for all updates, as the responsible party you'll be hearing directly. And I watched the typing indicator blink like a tiny flare of panic he was trying to hide under jokes, then stop, then start again, before he finally replied with a paragraph that did the strange two-step of an apology that never arrives, a paragraph about how stressed he had been, how I, of all people, should understand pressure, how cars can be fixed, but relationships are delicate, a paragraph that ended with the suggestion that I could just say I had been in the car too, which would clear up the confusion. A sentence so brazen it made my scalp prickle. I did not answer that message, not because I lacked words, but because I had something better than words, and while the coffee cooled I opened my laptop, navigated to the insurer's portal, and uploaded a tidy packet I had assembled in the quiet hours since the crash, the time-stamped doorbell camera clip showing Eric pocketing my keys from the bowl by the entryway, the neighbor's text confirming he had heard the engine rev and watched the car peel out while I was still in pajamas upstairs, screenshots of Eric's own public posts taken later that morning where the caption read "Rough start, LOL," under a photo of the crumpled bumper, and the PDF of his email to me acknowledging that I never said no when he wanted to borrow it, which, in the small courtroom of common sense, reads like a confession carved in neon. I wish I could say I uploaded those files without feeling a knot in my chest, but the truth is that even as I clicked submit, I could hear my mother's voice rehearsing its lines about families handling things privately and not dragging outsiders into our business. And I could picture the exact expression my father would wear when he realized the shop's polite notices had turned into invoices addressed to his son, and I knew that choosing not to absorb the blow myself would be interpreted as cruelty rather than boundary, which is the strange mathematics of families like ours, where the person who builds the fence is accused of shutting people out while the person who keeps kicking holes in it is praised for being open-hearted. Still, I did it, because clever revenge, the kind that satisfies in the marrow rather than in the moment, is rarely about spectacle. It is about refusing to serve as the cushion that lets someone else bounce away from their impact, and it is about building a record that does not flinch when memory tries to become fiction. The shop called again and, this time, I took it, because the manager had the unruffled tone of a man who has seen every flavor of family drama unfold in his waiting room, and he informed me, with professional courtesy and a hint of sympathy, that storage fees would convert to a higher daily rate on Friday, that parts could not be ordered without authorization and deposit, and that the responsible driver had hung up on him twice and then promised a car tomorrow, a word that, in that context, meant never. I thanked him for the update, told him I understood the policy and appreciated the documentation, then asked if he would kindly add all call logs and messages to the file, and when he said of course, I felt a steadiness take root in me. The sensation of a floor that had finally stopped tilting, because for once the story would not be rewritten over Sunday dinner with sighs and selective details. For once there would be timestamps and names and lines that could not be smudged. That evening, when Mom invited me over for a quick chat and promised there would be cobbler, I went, not because I needed dessert, but because avoiding the conversation would only feed the myth that I had become cold and hard. And I wanted to look them in the eyes and tell them the truth in a voice that did not tremble. The living room smelled like cinnamon and effort, and on the coffee table sat a stack of printouts my father had prepared, budget notes, a rough repayment plan that assumed I would front the cost and Eric would pay me back as he could, and a list of chores he thought might make a symbolic amends, while my mother, with hands folded as if in prayer, began with the oldest spell she knows, the one where she narrates our history as a series of small sacrifices we made for each other, erasing the part where mine always cost money or time and his always cost me. I listened, hands in my lap, the way you listen to a lullaby you have outgrown, and when she finished I told them, as gently as I could, that I had already submitted documentation to the insurer and the shop, that the case would proceed according to policy, and that while I loved them, I would not be signing anything, fronting anything, or confirming anything that was not true. Eric, who had been skulking in the hallway like a teenager caught sneaking out, burst into the room with a furious lecture about betrayal and loyalty and how I had trapped him, and for a moment I did feel a flicker of doubt. Because there is a part of me that prefers peace to righteousness and would rather pay twice than be called cruel, but I let the doubt pass through me and said quietly that I had not trapped him. I had simply stepped out of the trap myself, and if that felt like a snare, snapping shut around his ankle, perhaps he should ask why he had needed me standing underneath him all these years to cushion the fall. He threw up his hands, declared dramatically that he would handle it without me, and stormed outside to make a call, leaving the front door open to the cold and the sound of his voice rising and falling as he negotiated with air. When he returned, pale and tight-lipped, he announced that the insurer had questions about his initial statement and would be following up in writing. A phrase that made my mother blink and my father look down at his papers as if the numbers had shuffled themselves into an alphabet he could no longer read, and I took that as my cue to stand, thank them for dinner, and leave before the conversation could collapse into the usual cycle of pleading and blame. In the driveway, with the porch light painting the concrete a yellow that made everything look older than it was, my phone vibrated with an email notification, and when I saw the subject line, request for verification of driver identity, I felt the tiniest guilty thrill, not because I wanted him to suffer, but because the truth had finally placed its hand on my shoulder and said, "I will walk with you if you let me." I sat in my car and drafted a reply that included the packet I had already uploaded, added the case number, and provided the contact information for the neighbor who had seen the car leave, then hesitated over the send button, hearing the whisper of that old instinct that would make me the shield again, before I pressed it anyway, because letting go is not always noble, sometimes it is simply necessary. The engine turned over, the dash lights blinked, and for a brief second I thought about the way this would end, whether in reconciliation or a crater, and I told myself I would accept either outcome as long as it was honest, then shifted into reverse and backed out into the street, unaware until the headlights swept the curb that a second envelope sat wedged beneath my wiper blade, sealed with the stark efficiency of a courthouse and stamped with a return address that made my stomach drop. Because this time it wasn't the insurer at all, it was the clerk of the municipal court, and the letter was addressed to me. The envelope from the municipal court rode home with me like a passenger who refused to speak yet kept adjusting the temperature, and, while every sensible impulse told me to park, walk inside, and read it at the kitchen table with a glass of water and both feet on the ground, I tore it open under the dome light because curiosity can be as reckless as adrenaline, then unfolded the notice that informed me, in the sterile cadence of government paper, that I had been listed as the driver in an incident involving property damage and potential false reporting, and that I was required to appear or supply a sworn statement within a narrow window of days, which would have felt like the floor dropping out from under me if I had not already learned to expect the particular brand of survival that thrives in Eric's orbit, where honesty is elastic and paperwork is a canvas waiting for his favorite brushstroke, the one that paints me as the responsible adult who will absorb the mess without complaint. I read the letter twice, then held it at the length a person holds a photograph of an unpleasant memory, and felt the first clean crack of anger that is not fire, but ice, the kind that preserves the shape of everything for later inspection. Because this was not just thoughtless entitlement anymore. This was an active reach for my throat dressed up as clerical error, and it meant he had taken his performance beyond the family audience and into the lobby of consequences. I did not cry, and I did not call my mother, who would have laced the shock with a plea for patience and a suggestion that perhaps the officer had misheard and perhaps Eric had been nervous and perhaps the universe could be persuaded to misunderstand a little longer if I would simply offer the right smile. Instead, I drove to the precinct listed on the notice, walked in with the letter, produced my driver's license and the insurer's case number, and asked to attach a notarized statement together. With the time-stamped doorbell video and the neighbor's testimonial, which the clerk received with the weary gratitude of someone who has spent a working life adjudicating the space between stories and facts. When I emerged, the sky had shifted into that late blue that makes everything look honest, and I felt, not triumphant, but anchored, because a record had been planted on the side of truth and it would not wander home to be rewritten over cobbler. On the drive back, I called the insurers. Investigator referenced the court notice and confirmed that any contact from their office would now go directly to the responsible party, whose number and email, I helpfully noted, had been provided by the responsible party himself in a previous call, a small circle I admitted I found poetic. By Saturday, my mother had orchestrated a reset dinner that sounded as benign as chamomile tea and tasted as bitter as aspirin, and though I considered refusing, I went because avoidance paints its own unflattering portrait. And I wanted to stand in that room beneath the stale chandelier and say the words that belonged to me without rage or apology. The house looked exactly the same as it had when we were children, which is to say it had gathered the kind of dust that a family refuses to name, and when I stepped into the dining room, Eric was already there with the same grin that has always served as his favorite mask, working the salt shaker with both hands as though the performance required props, and my father, who had printed new pages full of math that assumed miracles, cleared his throat and announced that he had a plan that would keep outsiders out of our business. My mother clasped her fingers and began the invocation about forgiveness, a word she wields with the stubbornness of a gardener watering plastic plants, and when she reached the part where she accused me of letting resentment erode the family, I took a breath long enough to hold a paragraph and asked whether we might talk in the plain light of verifiable facts rather than the soft glow of tradition, because I had brought something that could help. I placed the insurance report on the table with the careful politeness one uses to lay down a fragile heirloom, flipped to the page that identified the driver as an unauthorized user with a restricted license, underlined the clause that stated the policyholder was not liable for the damages, and then produced the court notice that named me as the driver in an officer's log before listing the subsequent correction. A correction that did not appear from the compassion of angels, but from documentation, and I watched the three faces I know better than my own move through the same weather in different seasons. My father's darkening thunder of recognition, my mother's summer denial that wilts but refuses to fall, and Eric's jittery early spring in which nothing rooted yet everything tried. He began to sputter about misunderstandings and stressed officers, and a mistaken name offered in the panic of the tow yard, a story so thin a draft could carry it away, and I let him speak because silence, when weighted with evidence, grows heavy quickly, then said in the voice I have never used with him that panic does not fill out forms, panic does not sign, panic does not list the policyholder as present when the doorbell video shows otherwise, and panic does not send court notices addressed to me unless panic had a guiding hand. My father asked, in the small voice of a man staring at the face of a bill that will not fold in half, what exactly the investigator planned to do, and I answered that the shop would continue to bill the responsible driver, that the insurer would pursue reimbursement through subrogation if necessary, and that the court would either take my sworn statement or see me in person with the video and the neighbor prepared to speak under oath. And then I did something that felt like a hinge quietly. Turning in the house we had built of excuses, I slid a printed transcript of Eric's email across the table, the one where he wrote that I never said no when he wanted to borrow the car, and I asked them to read the entire thread out loud, because sometimes hearing your own words bounce off plaster strips the varnish from their intentions. My mother reached for the transcript with hands that trembled, read the sentence, and set the paper down as if it had burned her, while Eric tried to laugh and failed, his mouth shaping something cocky that never made it into sound. I did not shout, because the revenge I wanted was not noise, it was the kind of stillness that comes after a door closes and the latch finds its pocket, so I told them, with a steadiness I earned the hard way, that my boundaries were not punishments but seatbelts, that we could drive together if everyone kept theirs fastened, and that because history has taught me the universe takes requests most seriously when they arrive in writing, I had already asked the insurer to lock all communications. To the responsible party, had requested that the shop require his authorization in person with identification, and had notified the court that any attempt to attribute the incident to me would be met with documentation and a willingness to testify. Eric swore that I had blindsided him, so I reminded him that the road has been painted with warnings for years, and that ignoring signage is not the same as being ambushed. My father stood up, sat down, and stared at the report as if a path might appear. If he stared long enough, while my mother murmured that we needed to find a way not to ruin Eric's future, a phrase that floated above the table like a balloon refusing to learn gravity. I gathered the papers, slid them back into the envelope, and told them I was leaving before we repeated ourselves into uselessness, then paused at the doorway because the final move of the evening was not thunderous but exact, and I wanted to feel it land. So I turned to Eric and explained that, beginning Monday, his vehicle registration suspensions would trigger on any attempt to list me as an insured operator without my written consent, a simple notation the agent had been happy to add after our call, and that any future claim involving my name would be flagged for fraud review, which meant the next time he tried to climb into my life through the spreadsheet, the door would not budge. He asked how I had done that and when, the way a magician's audience begs to see the trapdoor, and I smiled the kind of smile that contains an entire architecture of patience, then said only that some protections are easier to build than to dismantle, and that it is astonishing what you can accomplish behind someone's back when you finally stop pretending their hands are clean. I walked into the night with the envelope under my arm and the porch light buzzing behind me, and as I reached the car my phone brightened with a new email, the subject line so brief it looked like a dare notice of formal review, followed by a time and a location that did not belong to my calendar. At which point I realized that the investigator had moved faster than I expected, and that the next conversation would not be held over family dessert, but across a table where the pens have chains, and if I wanted the last word to be the truth, I would have to bring everything I had saved, including the one thing I had not yet revealed to anyone at that table. The conference room where the investigator asked us to meet had the unremarkable cleanliness of places that handle other people's crises for a living, with a view of a parking lot that might as well have been a blank wall. And as I set the folder on the table and watched Eric stroll in 2 minutes late with my parents in tow and a carefully casual expression that sagged at the corners whenever he glanced at the badge on the investigator's belt, I realized that the story I had been carrying like a heavy bag was about to be set down in public, sorted into piles, labeled with dates and times, and weighed against the versions we tell when dinner plates are involved, which meant I would have to be as careful with my calm as I had been with my evidence. The investigator, who introduced himself with the kind of crisp politeness that feels like a ruler laid gently on a desk, asked us to confirm our names and relationship, then clicked a recorder to life, and while my mother's fingers braided each other in her lap, and my father kept adjusting his reading glasses as if clarity could be coaxed back onto his face by force of habit, I unlatched the folder, slid the doorbell footage across the table, and began the long, even walk through what happened, naming only what I could prove and leaving out every insult that would have felt satisfying but would not have survived cross-examination. I showed the timestamp where Eric's hand reached into the bowl for my keys, the neighbor's message that pinged my phone at dawn, the shop's call log annotated with increasingly urgent requests for authorization and deposit, the email thread in which he proposed that I claim to have been with him to clear up confusion, and the insurer's report that marked him as an unauthorized operator with restricted status. And when the investigator asked why the municipal notice had listed me as the driver, before being corrected, I said that I did not wish to guess at another adult's motives on the record, then added, because truth deserves a steady escort, that the correction had occurred only after my submission of documentation, at which point the investigator nodded in a way that told me he had already read more than he was asking me to say. Eric tried on the shrugging tone that usually buys him time, offering a speech about nerves and chaos and the human tendency to misspeak when lights are bright and cars are bent, but the words fell apart at the edges when the investigator read a short excerpt from the tow yard intake, a sentence in which he had given my full name, spelled correctly, as the operator, and then asked whether he had any medical documentation of a concussion that might have made him confuse his own presence with mine, a question that turned my brother's color a shade of paper and produced a series of syllables that did not cohere. My parents, to their credit or their doom, tried to pivot the conversation toward forgiveness, and my mother talked about family repair and learning moments and the danger of letting one night define a future, while my father offered the outline of a repayment plan that assumed the insurer would be kind if we were cooperative, but the investigator, still polite, explained that the file had already been referred to subrogation for recovery and that misrepresentation of a driver could be construed as insurance fraud depending on the prosecutor's appetite, which, translated out of his gentle diction, meant that the world had grown teeth and would not hesitate to use them if invited. He turned to me then, asked if I had anything further to add, and I understood that the moment for the thing I had not told anyone had arrived, so I took a breath, slid a slim document to the center of the table, and said that 3 days after the crash, while everyone argued about feelings and premiums, I had filed an affidavit of non-permission with the state, a simple piece of paper that sits very quietly in a database until law and insurance go looking, at which point it lights up like a flare and marks the line between a mistake and a boundary, and that the affidavit had been accepted and cross-referenced to this incident, which meant that from the state's perspective the question of authorization was not a debate at all but a matter of record. The reaction landed like weather changing in a single breath, with my mother whispering my name as though it had become a new word she did not know how to pronounce, my father staring at the signature as if it belonged to a stranger, and Eric, stripped of every mask at once, blurting out that I had set him up, which would have been funny if it had not been so bitter, because the only thing the affidavit had set was the scale that he had been tilting with his thumb since we were children. I did not gloat, and I did not apologize. I simply explained that the affidavit existed to protect policyholders from exactly this kind of unpermitted use, that it had no power over honest accidents, and that its only cruelty lay in its refusal to lie, then turned to the investigator and asked what the practical next steps looked like when the noise died down and the paperwork took the wheel. He answered with the soft finality of systems in motion. There would be a formal determination placing liability on the unauthorized driver. The body shop would bill accordingly and release the vehicle only upon his authorization and payment of storage and parts. The insurer would pay nothing and pursue recovery if any third-party property claim emerged. And the court would accept my sworn statement with exhibits, then decide whether the misreporting warranted a hearing, a process that could end in a fine, a class, or, if the prosecutor was feeling seasonal, something that would accompany his record for longer than any of us wanted to say out loud. And as he spoke, I watched the arithmetic of my family rearrange itself, with love and habit trying to hold the columns together while truth quietly changed the math. Eric asked whether there was any way to undo the affidavit or reclassify the event as a shared lapse in judgment, and the investigator, who had likely been waiting years to deliver a line that clean, said that time flows in one direction and that records do not become bedtime stories simply because we fall asleep while reading them. We stepped into the hallway with the folder lighter by several copies, and when the elevator doors closed, my mother turned to me with eyes that had lost their script and asked whether I realized what this could do to his future. And I told her that I had thought about nothing else, that I had considered every off-ramp and every soft landing, and that I had chosen, finally, to believe in the kind of future that begins when a person meets the ground and decides to stand on it without leaning on someone else's back, which is not a punishment so much as an introduction. I walked out into a sky the color of new steel, called the shop to confirm the hold, then drove to the lot where my car sat under a tarp that made it look like a sleeping animal. And I signed the release to a salvage buyer who had offered just enough to make repair a bad investment, a decision that stung and soothed in the same breath because it closed a loop that had stayed open for too long, and as I handed over the title, that now carried the name of the small protective company I had formed the week before. One final firewall Eric would never be able to kick through. I realized that revenge, at its best, is not fire at all. It is architecture. In the weeks that followed, invoices found their address. The court sent a notice that stopped just short of a charge. My father took up long walks that ended at benches where men read the paper very slowly. And my mother learned to ask how I was before asking what I could forgive, while Eric, who had always survived on a diet of other people's second chances, sent a brief message saying that the storage fees had been a way-up call, a phrase that felt like a truce offering and a deflection. All at once, and I stared at it until the screen dimmed, unsure whether to answer with hope or caution. I never told them about the second thing I did, the one that sits in my desk like a sealed compass, a credit freeze, and a fraud alert that ensure no new account bears my name without my voice, because not every protection needs an audience. And not every ending wants applause, and when people ask, later, whether I regret how far I took it, I think about the quiet that moved into my house once the keys stayed where I left them, and I think about the way the truth, when it finally stood up, made a space for me at my own table, and I answer that I learned something rarer than forgiveness, namely that love without boundaries is just weather. And I prefer a climate I can live in, even if the forecast keeps a little mystery at the edges.